The teacher's harsh words cut through the classroom, targeting the young girl in the front row. "Why don't you just keep quiet? People like you don't belong here," she sneered, her words dripping with disdain. The girl, hurt but determined, stood her ground and spoke up. She refused to let the injustice slide, calling out the teacher for her racism. But instead of listening, the teacher's response was swift and brutal. Without warning, she expelled the girl from the class, the entire room going quiet in stunned disbelief. The girl's heart raced, the sting of both the injustice and the humiliation sinking in. However, as she gathered her things, something unexpected happened. The door swung open, and the girl's mother walked into the school. Her identity was about to leave everyone in shock. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just any mother. They had no idea who they were about to face. What happens when a mother and daughter stand up against a system that's stacked against them? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The classroom fell silent as the teacher's voice echoed through the room. A comment, casual and offhand, was made to a group of students, but one person couldn't let it slide. Mia, a quiet girl who usually kept to herself, sat in the back of the room, her eyes wide with disbelief. The words hit her harder than she expected. Her teacher, Mrs. Adams, had made a comment about people from her community that made Mia's stomach turn. She tried to ignore it. She really did. But the words lingered in her mind. She had heard similar things before, but this time, something inside her snapped. She couldn't keep quiet. Mia raised her hand, and when the teacher called on her, Mia's voice was steady, but filled with the weight of years of frustration. "Mrs. Adams, that's not right," Mia said, her heart racing as she spoke. "What you just said was offensive." The class went silent. Mrs. Adams's face twisted, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Mia. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice sharp. Mia repeated herself. That comment was wrong. People shouldn't talk about others like that. Instead of offering an apology or hearing her out, Mrs. Adams's expression darkened. In a move no one expected, she pointed toward the door. "Mia, you're disrupting my class. I want you out. Now." Mia stood there, frozen. She couldn't believe what was happening. This was the teacher who was supposed to guide them, not make them feel small. But she didn't back down. With her head held high, she turned and walked out of the classroom. And that wasn't the end of it. Mrs. Adams had already made a decision, one that would send shockwaves through the school. But little did anyone know, Mia wasn't the only one with a strong voice. Her mother, Sarah, was about to arrive, and her identity was something no one in that school could have ever anticipated. Mia stood in the hallway outside Mrs. Adams's classroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected things to go so far, but now she was out of class, standing alone in the corridor, unsure of what would happen next. She had spoken up because she couldn't stand the hurtful words, but now she wondered if she had done the right thing. As the minutes passed, the school seemed to move on without her. The hum of conversations in the hallways and the sound of lockers opening and closing seemed distant. Mia's thoughts raced. She had been humiliated, but worse. She felt like she was being punished for standing up against something wrong. She wanted to be strong, but the reality of being punished for speaking out was hitting her harder than she thought. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and slowly, other students began to trickle into the hallway. Mia watched them pass, feeling an overwhelming sense of isolation. None of them looked at her, and it was as if the incident had never happened. But Mia couldn't forget. She had stood up for herself, and now she was paying the price. It wasn't long before the door to Mrs. Adams's classroom opened, and a familiar face appeared. Mia's best friend, Lisa. Lisa's face was filled with concern as she rushed over to Mia. "Mia, what happened? Mrs. Adams said you were disrespectful and kicked you out of class." Lisa's voice was filled with disbelief. She had seen the entire incident unfold, and to her it didn't seem right. I just couldn't stay silent, Lisa, Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. She said something wrong, something racist, and I couldn't just let it go. Lisa nodded. She knew how Mia felt. Lisa had often been the one to listen to Mia's frustrations about the way people treated others based on race. But now, it felt different. Mia had spoken out, but she was left standing there alone with no one really supporting her. Before Lisa could respond, the principal, Mr. Turner, walked by. He noticed Mia standing there, her face filled with frustration and anger. "Mia, I need you to come with me to my office," Mr. Turner said, his tone calm but firm. Mia hesitated. She had never been in trouble before. The last thing she wanted was to be dragged into the principal's office, but she knew she had no choice. She followed him quietly, her heart racing as she wondered what was coming next. The walk to Mr. Turner's office felt like it lasted forever. With each step, the anxiety built. She had done nothing wrong, but she was being treated like she had. When they reached the office, Mr. Turner motioned for her to sit down. "Mia, I've just spoken with Mrs. Adams," he said, sitting behind his desk. "She says you were disruptive in class, and it seems that things escalated quickly." Mia's chest tightened. She knew she had to defend herself, but she also didn't want to make things worse. "Mr. Turner, I was only speaking out because Mrs. Adams said something racist. I couldn't just sit there and ignore it," Mia explained, trying to keep her voice steady. Mr. Turner sighed, his expression unreadable. "I understand that you felt upset, Mia, but it's important to handle things calmly. You can't just disrupt the class. I'll have to report this, and you'll likely be suspended for the day." Mia's heart sank. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had done the right thing, and now she was being punished. It didn't feel fair. Just then, the door opened again, and a woman stepped into the office. It was Mrs. Adams. Her face was flushed with anger, and she didn't look like someone willing to listen. "Mia has disrupted my class, Mr. Turner. She needs to learn that actions have consequences," Mrs. Adams said, her tone sharp. Mia could feel the tension in the room, but she refused to back down. She had spoken up, and she wouldn't let anyone make her feel guilty for it. Before anything else could happen, the office door suddenly swung open again. This time, it was a different person who walked in. Mia's mother, Sarah. She had arrived at the school after hearing about what happened. Mia's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea her mother was on her way, but Sarah's presence immediately filled the room with an undeniable sense of authority. Mrs. Adams's expression changed, and Mr. Turner looked slightly taken aback. "Sarah," Mr. Turner greeted her, his tone now a bit more reserved. "I assume you're here to talk about your daughter?" Sarah, standing tall with a calm demeanor, nodded. She knew what had happened. She had heard from Mia's friend, Lisa, and wasn't going to let her daughter face this alone. "Mia didn't deserve to be expelled," Sarah said firmly, her eyes locking with Mrs. Adams. "She stood up for what was right." Mrs. Adams fumbled for words, but the silence between the adults in the room made it clear that this situation was far from over. Mia sat in the principal's office, her mind racing. She still couldn't believe everything had escalated so quickly. She had only spoken out because Mrs. Adams made a racist comment in class, but now she was being treated like the problem. Her hands trembled as she clasped them together in her lap, waiting for her mom to finish talking to the principal. Mrs. Adams was still standing by Mr. Turner's desk, looking annoyed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her tone was harsh, and Mia could hear the words disruption and discipline thrown around. Mia couldn't help but feel the sting of the unfair treatment. She had been the one wronged, yet she was the one facing consequences. Her mother, Sarah, remained calm, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Adams. Mia had always admired her mother's ability to stay composed, even in the toughest situations. Sarah knew how to speak her mind without raising her voice, but her presence alone commanded respect. "Mrs. Adams, I understand you're upset, but what happened in that classroom today was unacceptable. Mia spoke up because she felt hurt, not because she wanted to cause trouble, Sarah said, her voice steady and strong. Mrs. Adams opened her mouth to protest, but Sarah didn't let her. I'm not here to argue about who's right or wrong. What I do know is that Mia has a right to speak out against injustice, especially when it's happening to her. Sarah turned to Mr. Turner, who had been silent up until this point. I would like you to reconsider the suspension. I know my daughter, and she doesn't deserve this. If there's an issue with her behavior, it should have been addressed in a way that promotes understanding, not punishment. Mr. Turner shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had heard both sides of the story, and now he was stuck. On one hand, he didn't want to escalate things further, but on the other, he was unsure how to handle a situation involving racism and a strong-willed student like Mia. He glanced at Mrs. Adams, who seemed to be growing more impatient. This is a serious matter, Mrs. Harris, Mr. Turner said, his voice firm. Mia's actions have disrupted the class, and that's not something. This is a serious matter, Mrs. Harris, Mr. Turner said, his voice firm. Mia's actions have disrupted the class, and that's not something we can ignore. I'm afraid we're going to have to follow protocol. Protocol? Sarah's voice rose slightly, but it was still controlled. What about the protocol that says students should feel safe and respected in school? What about the protocol that says racism has no place in our classrooms? Mrs. Adams made an inappropriate comment, and my daughter was punished for speaking up. That's the real issue here. Mia's heart pounded as she listened to the back and forth. Her mom was right. She had done the right thing by speaking out, but now everything was spiraling out of control. The principal and Mrs. Adams were focused on their own rules, but Mia felt like nobody was listening to the real problem, the hurtful words that had been said in the first place. Without warning, there was a loud knock on the door. It startled everyone in the room, and they all turned to see a police officer standing in the doorway. Officer Barnes, the school resource officer, had arrived at Mr. Turner's request. His face was expressionless as he stepped inside. Mia Harris? Officer Barnes asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Mia's stomach dropped. What was going on? She had only spoken up against a racist comment, and now a police officer was here to deal with her. Sarah stood up, stepping in front of Mia instinctively. What's going on? Is there some kind of misunderstanding here? Mr. Turner cleared his throat, trying to calm the situation. It's just standard procedure. Officer Barnes is here to speak with Mia. There's no need to panic. Mia could feel her palms sweating. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had spoken out, and now she was facing a situation that felt like it was out of her control. Officer Barnes looked at Mia, his expression unreadable. Mia, I'm afraid I need you to come with me. You're being placed under arrest for disrupting school activities. Mia froze. Arrest? She couldn't believe it. This was all because she had stood up for herself. She looked up at her mother, searching for some kind of reassurance, but Sarah's face was filled with shock and concern. Arrest, Sarah repeated in disbelief. For what? For standing up to racism? I'm afraid so, ma'am, Officer Barnes said, his voice firm, yet lacking any warmth. I've been told to escort Mia to the police car. Mia felt a knot form in her stomach. This couldn't be real. She had done the right thing, and now she was being treated like a criminal. She turned to her mom, the woman who had always fought for justice, who had taught her to be brave, to stand tall, and to never back down. Mama, I didn't do anything wrong, Mia said, her voice trembling. She didn't want to cry in front of everyone, but it was hard to hold back the tears. Sarah's face softened and she kneeled down to Mia's level. I know, baby, I know. This isn't fair, and we're going to fight this. You did the right thing. Mia felt the weight of her mother's words. Her heart swelled with both sadness and pride. She had been brave, but the situation felt so much bigger now. It was more than just one comment in a classroom. It was about the system, about how the world saw people like her. She was just a girl, trying to do the right thing, and now she was being punished. "I'll be right there with you, Mia. We're in this together," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with determination. Officer Barnes motioned for Mia to stand up. "We need to go now." Mia took one last look at her mother before standing up. As she walked out of the office, she could feel the eyes of the other students on her, watching her every move. It wasn't just about the punishment now, it was about the injustice she was facing. The long walk to the front of the school felt like an eternity, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the sun was shining, but it felt cold, distant. Mia climbed into the back of the police car, her hands shaking. This wasn't how she had imagined things would go. She had stood up for herself, for what was right, and now she was being arrested for it. As the car doors slammed shut, Mia glanced out the window, seeing her mother standing at the school entrance, watching her. Mia didn't know what the next steps were, but one thing was for sure: this fight was far from over. As the police car rolled down the street, Mia sat in the back, her mind swirling with confusion and anger. She couldn't believe this was happening to her. She had simply spoken up in class after Mrs. Adams made a racist comment, and now she was being arrested like a criminal. Her hands, still trembling from the shock, pressed against her jeans, trying to calm herself. Outside the car, the world seemed to be moving in slow motion. People walked down the sidewalk, chatting, completely unaware of what was happening just a few feet away. Mia wanted to shout out to them, to tell them what had just happened, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong so fast. As the car made its way to the police station, Mia's thoughts went to her mother. Sarah had always taught her to stand up for what's right, no matter the consequences. She had always been the one who protected Mia from the harsh realities of the world. But today, it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. She felt alone, even though she knew her mother was fighting to make things right. The car came to a halt in front of the police station, and the officer in the front seat glanced back at her. "Mia Harris, we're here. Step out of the car." Mia swallowed hard and opened the door. The harsh brightness of the station lights made her squint as she stepped out onto the cold pavement. The station was quiet, and the few people who were there looked up as she was escorted inside. She could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others judgmental. Inside the station, Officer Barnes led her to a holding cell. As the metal door clanged shut behind her, Mia felt a wave of dread wash over her. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had done nothing wrong. Her fingers brushed over the cold bars, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. This wasn't over. She would fight back. Meanwhile, outside the police station, Sarah had been frantic ever since Mia was taken away. She had called every number she could think of, trying to reach someone who could help. She couldn't believe this was happening to her daughter. Mia didn't deserve this, not for speaking out against racism. Sarah had spent years teaching her daughter the importance of standing up for what was right, and now here they were, caught in a battle they hadn't expected. She had just finished speaking with her lawyer when her phone buzzed. It was a message from her best friend, Lisa. "I've been seeing what's happening on social media. Everyone is talking about it. People are outraged." Sarah felt her heart sink. This wasn't just about Mia anymore. It was bigger than that. News of Mia's arrest had already spread like wildfire, and now people all over town were demanding answers. Sarah had never wanted her daughter to be the center of attention like this, but now that she was, she would use it to her advantage. This wasn't just about a racist teacher or a fight in a classroom. It was about injustice, and it was time for it to be exposed. Sarah wasted no time. She picked up the phone again, calling her lawyer. "We need to act fast. Mia is being held, and I won't let them get away with this. It's time to make sure everyone knows what happened." By the time Sarah arrived at the police station, the place was buzzing. Reporters were already standing outside, their cameras aimed at the entrance. The situation had escalated far beyond the walls of the school. The community was watching, and Sarah knew she had to act quickly. As she entered the police station, the officer at the front desk looked up in surprise. "You must be Sarah Harris, Mia's mother. We've been expecting you." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. "I need to see my daughter now." The officer didn't hesitate. "Follow me." Sarah walked quickly through the sterile, quiet hallways, her thoughts racing. What would Mia be thinking right now? Would she be okay? She had to make sure her daughter knew she wasn't alone in this fight. Sarah had faced her own battles in the past, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. When Sarah was finally led to the small room where Mia was being held, her heart nearly stopped. Mia sat on a bench, her eyes staring at the ground, lost in thought. The sight of her daughter, so small and vulnerable, broke something inside Sarah. But she couldn't let the emotions overwhelm her. She had to stay strong, for Mia and for the future they were going to fight for. "Mia," Sarah said softly, walking over to her daughter. Mia looked up, her face pale, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Mom, what's happening? Why am I here?" Mia's voice cracked, but she was trying to stay composed. Sarah knelt down in front of her daughter, taking her hands in hers. "I'm here, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. We're going to get through this together. I promise." The words didn't make Mia feel better, but they gave her the reassurance she desperately needed. Sarah knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they were in it together. Sarah's heart was racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to be the pillar for Mia now. "I'm going to get you out of here, Mia. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened," Sarah said firmly. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Lisa. "I've just seen the school's social media page. The outrage is real. People are ready to stand up with you." Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of everything hitting her all at once. The community was with them, and that made her feel stronger. She stood up, pulling Mia to her feet. "We're not alone. People are already fighting for justice. This is far from over, Mia. We will make sure your voice is heard." As the two of them walked out of the holding area, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. Things were moving fast, and she needed to stay one step ahead. The community was beginning to rally behind them, and that meant the truth would soon be out in the open. But it also meant that the battle was just beginning, and Sarah was ready for it. The arrest of Mia Harris spread quickly, becoming a symbol of the systemic issues that had long plagued the community. Social media buzzed with posts, videos, and comments, most of them condemning the school, the teacher, and the police. The outrage was palpable. People from all walks of life were speaking out, their voices rising in unison. It wasn't just about a girl being wrongfully treated in class anymore. This was about the bigger issues that had been buried under the surface for far too long. Sarah Harris sat at her kitchen table, her phone screen glowing with notifications. As the hours passed, the number of comments, posts, and calls kept growing. Some were supportive, while others were full of anger, disbelief, and, surprisingly, hatred. But none of it surprised her. She had been expecting it. She knew the road ahead was going to be rough. Sarah was no stranger to hardship. She had worked hard to raise Mia, teaching her how to stand up for herself and to fight against the injustices she would inevitably face. But now, as her daughter's face was splashed all over the news, Sarah found herself battling a system that had been built to suppress voices like Mia's. The fact that the system was now fighting back, through social media outrage, threats, and accusations, only fueled Sarah's determination. As the days passed, news outlets picked up the story. The arrest of Mia was now national news. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, the phone rang. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the caller ID. "Sarah, it's Lisa. Are you watching the news?" "No, I've been too busy with everything else. What's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with concern. "You need to turn on the TV now," Lisa said, her tone urgent. It's getting worse. People are calling for Mia to be expelled, and now they're demanding justice for Mrs. Adams. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she grabbed the remote. The screen flickered to life, and there, on the news, was a crowd of people gathered outside the school. Some were holding signs with Mrs. Adams' name, calling for her to be reinstated. Others were chanting, demanding the punishment of Mia for causing a scene in class. "Mia Harris is just a troublemaker," one protester shouted into a microphone. "She's the one who caused all this chaos in the school." A wave of anger surged through Sarah. How could they be blaming her daughter? All Mia had done was speak out against the racism that had been festering in that classroom. But Sarah knew this was the reality of living in a community where some still believed that discrimination was justified. They couldn't let the truth get in the way of their outdated beliefs. Sarah immediately turned off the TV, her hands shaking. She couldn't let herself get consumed by this, not now. Mia needed her more than ever. Meanwhile, at the school, the situation was growing more intense. Students who had supported Mia were now being targeted. Teachers were being questioned, and Mrs. Adams, the teacher at the center of it all, was receiving messages from all over the country, some condemning her actions, others defending her. But it wasn't just the school that was divided. The community itself was torn. The local church, usually a place of comfort and solidarity, was now divided on the issue. Some members stood in support of Sarah and Mia, while others insisted that Mrs. Adams, despite her mistakes, was a dedicated teacher who didn't deserve the backlash. The media couldn't get enough of the story. Television stations were airing debates on the subject, with experts weighing in on both sides. But in all the noise, the truth about what really happened was getting lost. The debate wasn't about racism anymore. It was about sides. It was about which group you were aligned with, Mia and her family, or the old-school defenders of a broken system. One evening, as Sarah was preparing for another round of interviews, a message popped up on her phone. It was from the local newspaper asking for a statement. They wanted to hear from her, but Sarah knew that her words could be twisted. She had seen how quickly the media could turn things around, making a victim out to be the villain. But then, Sarah remembered something. Her daughter had always been strong, and if there was one thing Mia had taught her, it was that speaking the truth could set you free. She had to trust that doing what was right would eventually lead to justice, even if it wasn't immediate. The next morning, Sarah walked to the podium at a press conference, flanked by Mia. Reporters lined the room, their cameras flashing, eager for a statement. Sarah took a deep breath and began. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Harris, and I am the mother of Mia Harris, the young girl who was wrongfully arrested after speaking out against the racial discrimination she faced in her classroom." The room fell silent. Sarah continued, her voice strong and steady. What happened to Mia was not just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that has been ignored for too long. Mia did not deserve to be treated the way she was. No child should be. But the response we are seeing now, attacking Mia for speaking up, calling her a troublemaker, is exactly the problem. This is why we must confront racism in every corner of our society. We must hold those who perpetuate it accountable. We cannot let our children suffer because of ignorance. The press conference was a turning point. For the first time in days, Sarah felt like she had regained some control. Her words were out there. The community was listening, whether they liked it or not. As the press conference ended, Sarah and Mia walked off the stage, their heads held high. The next few days would be challenging, but Sarah knew that by standing up for what was right, they were already making a difference. The backlash from the community was far from over, but Sarah could see that the conversation was shifting. More and more people were joining the fight for justice, speaking out against the treatment of Mia and others who had faced similar injustices. Slowly but surely, the tides were turning. The more people rallied behind Mia's story, the harder it became for the old guard to hold on to their beliefs. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for Mia, and for all those who had been wronged would take time. It would take persistence. But with the support of the community and the courage of people like Mia, Sarah was ready to see this fight through to the end. The aftermath of the public backlash had left a noticeable mark on both the school and the community. But in the midst of the storm, a sense of hope began to blossom. Mia's arrest had sparked a conversation that had been long overdue, a conversation about race, justice, and equality. The wounds of the past were still fresh, but the possibility of healing seemed closer than ever. As Sarah Harris and Mia walked through the halls of their school, the atmosphere was different. Teachers, students, and parents who had previously remained silent were now speaking out. There was a new sense of responsibility in the air. People were beginning to realize that change was not just a matter of fighting back. It was about understanding, learning, and doing better. The school district had been forced to take action. They knew they couldn't just sweep this under the rug. The public outcry had been too loud. In response, the school board initiated a series of meetings to address the issues raised by Mia's arrest. These meetings weren't just about finding a scapegoat. They were about acknowledging the systemic issues that had allowed the situation to unfold in the first place. Mia's teacher, Mrs. Adams, had been placed on leave, pending an internal investigation. The school knew that there had to be a deep dive into the way incidents like this had been handled, and they realized that real change couldn't come from superficial fixes. It required a complete reevaluation of their policies and practices. At one of the school meetings, Sarah was asked to speak. The room was filled with administrators, parents, and educators, all eager to find a solution. Sarah knew this was her chance to make sure Mia's story wasn't forgotten and to ensure that the conversation stayed focused on systemic change. "I'm here today not just as a mother but as a member of this community," Sarah began. "What happened to my daughter was not just a personal tragedy. It's a reflection of the larger issues that continue to affect many people, especially people of color. But Mia is not just a victim. She's a survivor. And through her, we all have the chance to learn. This isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding the deep-seated prejudices that exist in our systems and working together to change them." Her words resonated deeply within the room. Several teachers who had previously been hesitant to engage in such discussions now stepped forward. They admitted that they had never fully understood the realities of racism and how it manifested in the classroom. They acknowledged that they had a responsibility to do better, to be better educators, and to stand up against injustices, no matter how small. Sarah's words had opened a door. The school began working with outside experts, community leaders, racial justice advocates, and even former students who had experienced similar issues, to create training sessions for the staff. The goal was clear. Education was key. Teachers needed to be educated about the unconscious biases they held and how those biases affected their teaching, their interactions with students, and their overall approach to discipline. Meanwhile, Mia, who had been at the center of this storm, found herself growing in strength. The support from her mother, her friends, and even some of her classmates had bolstered her courage. Mia was no longer just a girl who had been silenced by a racist teacher. She was a voice for those who felt powerless. She realized that her actions had inspired others to speak up too. As part of the school's new initiative, Mia was invited to participate in a panel discussion about racism and student advocacy. She was nervous at first, unsure of how her voice would be received, but as she spoke, she felt a sense of empowerment that she had never experienced before. "It wasn't just about me standing up that day," Mia said during the panel. "It was about everyone who had been afraid to speak up. I want to be the reason someone else finds their courage. It's not about being loud. It's about being true to yourself. No one should feel afraid to say what they know is right." Her words were met with applause. The room was filled with admiration and support. And as she looked out at the crowd, Mia saw something that made her heart swell. The future she had hoped for, one where people listened, where they cared, and where they were willing to change. It was happening. Mia's arrest had been a catalyst, but it wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a journey toward understanding, toward redemption for not just one teacher, but for an entire community. As the weeks passed, Sarah continued to advocate for the changes that were needed in their school, and her efforts were beginning to bear fruit. The school started implementing regular conversations about race, identity, and privilege in their classrooms. Teachers, students, and staff began to see each other in a new light. But there was still work to be done. Change didn't happen overnight. Mia knew that, and Sarah knew that too. They couldn't fix everything in one go, but they were willing to keep fighting, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better world. As Sarah looked at her daughter, now standing taller and more confident than ever, she realized something important. Mia wasn't just a young girl who had been wronged by the system. She was the one who was changing it. And for that, Sarah was proud beyond measure. As the dust settled from the chaos that had unfolded, the community of Fairhaven began to reflect on everything that had transpired. What started as an unfortunate incident had grown into a movement that rippled through schools, homes, and businesses alike. Sarah and Mia had ignited a spark, one that would continue to burn long after the headlines faded. In the days following the public meetings and changes at the school, Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction, not because of the progress that had been made, but because of the conversations that were now happening openly. People were no longer afraid to talk about race, injustice, and inequality. The silence that had once hovered over these topics had been shattered, and though the road ahead was long, the first steps had been taken. Mia, though still a young girl, had become a symbol of hope and resistance. Her courage had encouraged others, especially young students, to find their voices. As Sarah sat with her daughter one evening, reflecting on how far they had come, she knew that Mia's actions had changed not only her life, but the lives of countless others. "You're not just my daughter anymore," Sarah told her one day, her voice filled with pride. "You've become a voice for so many others. You've taught me things I never realized I needed to learn." Mia smiled softly. "We're all in this together, Mom. I just want to make sure no one else feels as small as I did that day. And if I can help someone else find the courage to speak up, then I'll know it was worth it." It was this realization, this awareness, that gave both Sarah and Mia a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced adversity head-on, and though they knew it wasn't over, they felt ready to continue the fight. But they weren't alone anymore. The community had rallied around them, and it was this collective strength that had the power to transform not just Fairhaven, but the world around them. The lessons learned were not just for Mia or for Sarah, but for the entire community. The importance of standing up when something is wrong, of using your voice, and of never backing down, no matter the odds. Sarah knew that this moment in time, this chapter in their lives, would forever be a defining one. But as they both looked forward, they knew that the work didn't stop with just one victory. The fight for justice, equality, and change was ongoing, and it would require everyone to continue working together, to keep pushing for what was right. The past couldn't be erased, but the future could be shaped. And so, as the school began to implement new policies and the town started to heal, Sarah and Mia walked forward, confident that they were on the right path. They had become symbols of hope, not just for Fairhaven, but for all communities facing the same struggles. In the end, the story of Mia and Sarah wasn't just about one girl standing up for what was right. It was about a community coming together to make lasting change. It was a reminder that the fight for justice is not easy, but with courage, persistence, and the support of others, anything is possible.